At 10:20 on the morning of June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky looked down from 14,000 feet and saw something that would change the course of history. 3 Japanese aircraft carriers, their decks packed with armed and fueled warplanes, lay spread across the Pacific like sitting ducks. McClusky had been flying for over 4 hours on a fuel tank that should have sent him home an hour ago. His fuel gauge was nearly empty. Every pilot in his squadron knew they might not make it back to their ship. But McClusky made a decision. He pushed his stick forward and began his dive. In the next 5 minutes, 3 of the most feared warships on Earth would be transformed into blazing infernos. The Japanese Navy, which had conquered half the Pacific in 6 months of unstoppable victories, would lose its offensive capability forever. And the United States, still reeling from Pearl Harbor, would begin the long road to victory. This is the story of the Battle of Midway, the 5 minutes that changed the world, and the extraordinary chain of luck, sacrifice, and intelligence that made it possible. To understand what happened at Midway, you first need to understand what Japan had accomplished in the 6 months before this battle. Since the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy had achieved the most rapid military expansion in modern history. Their conquests stretched from the Kuril Islands in the north, through the Gilbert Islands, the Solomon Islands, Southeast Asia, and into the Indian Ocean. Wake Island fell on December 23rd. The Philippines campaign ground through Bataan in April 1942 and Corregidor in May. Singapore, the so-called Gibraltar of the East, surrendered on February 15th in what became the worst British military disaster in history. The Dutch East Indies were completely overrun by March. On February 19th, Japanese aircraft bombed Darwin, Australia. The 6 aircraft carriers of the Kido Butai, the mobile striking force, had ranged across 2 oceans for 5 months, causing catastrophic damage to every Allied force they encountered. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. These names struck terror into Allied commanders across the Pacific. Japanese naval aviators were among the finest trained combat pilots in the world, and the Mitsubishi A-6M0 outperformed every Allied fighter it faced. Imperial forces controlled air and sea across an enormous arena. Every Japanese veteran interviewed after the war repeated the same term. They suffered from what they called victory disease, the conviction that they were unbeatable. But 2 events shattered this aura of invincibility. The Battle of the Coral Sea in early May 1942 became history's first carrier versus carrier engagement. The Japanese lost the light carrier Shoho, while the fleet carrier Shokaku was heavily damaged, and Zuikaku's air group was devastated. Both fleet carriers were unavailable for Midway, reducing Admiral Nagumo's strike force from 6 carriers to 4. More psychologically devastating was the Doolittle raid of April 18th, when 16 B-25 bombers launched from the carrier Hornet and struck Tokyo itself. The material damage was negligible, but Admiral Yamamoto became physically ill upon learning of the raid, American bombers over the Imperial Palace. The unthinkable had happened. Yamamoto now had his mandate. He would lure the American carriers into a decisive battle and destroy them before American industrial might could tip the balance. The American victory at Midway was born in a windowless, frigid basement beneath the 14th Naval District headquarters at Pearl Harbor. The men who worked there called it the dungeon. This was Station HYPO, the combat intelligence unit, commanded by Commander Joseph John Rochefort, a 42-year-old cryptanalyst and Japanese linguist who worked 20-hour days in a smoking jacket and slippers, sleeping on a cot beside his code-breaking machines. Rochefort had assembled the Navy's best minds. He hand-picked cryptanalysts, including Thomas Dyer, Wesley Wright, and Alva Laswell. He pressed into service the band of the sunken battleship California, musicians whose mathematical aptitude made them surprisingly effective codebreakers. His key collaborator was Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, Pacific Fleet Intelligence Officer and Rochefort's close friend from 3 years, studying Japanese together in Tokyo. Their target was JN-25, the Japanese Navy's primary operational code. JN-25 consisted of approximately 45,000 5-digit number groups, each representing a word or phrase, then further encrypted with random additive tables before transmission. Before Pearl Harbor, only 10 to 15% of the code could be read. By April 1942, Station HYPO was decrypting and translating Japanese messages within hours of transmission, approximately 140 messages per day. A scheduled Japanese codebook change was delayed, giving the codebreakers a critical window. By late May, Admiral Chester Nimitz could read enough of Yamamoto's operations order to reconstruct virtually the entire Japanese order of battle. By early May, Rochefort knew a major operation was being planned against a target designated AF in the Central Pacific. He was convinced AF meant Midway Atoll, but Washington's analysts disagreed. They insisted the target was the Aleutians, Port Moresby, New Caledonia, or even the American West Coast. To settle the argument, Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes of Rochefort's staff devised an elegant trick. With Nimitz's approval, the Midway garrison was contacted via secure undersea cable and instructed to broadcast in plain, unencrypted language. An emergency report that the island's water desalination plant had broken down, and they had only 2 weeks of fresh water remaining. Within 24 to 48 hours, American codebreakers intercepted a Japanese intelligence report stating that AF is short of water. The confirmation was absolute. Midway was the target. On May 27th, at the Pacific Fleet Staff Conference, Leighton delivered one of the most remarkable intelligence predictions in military history. He told Nimitz that the Japanese carriers would probably attack on the morning of June 4th from the northwest on a bearing of 325 degrees. They could be sighted at about 175 miles from Midway, at around 0600 to 0700 local time. When reports arrived on June 4th, Nimitz told Leighton that he had been only 5 minutes, 5 degrees, and 5 miles off. Admiral Yamamoto's Operation MI was the largest naval operation Japan had ever undertaken, committing virtually every operational warship in the Imperial Japanese Navy across approximately 2.5 million square miles of ocean. The combined fleet was divided into no fewer than 10 separate formations. The total commitment was staggering. 4 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 7 battleships, 15 cruisers, 42 destroyers, plus submarines, transports, seaplane carriers, and auxiliaries. Roughly 160 to 200 vessels in all, depending on what auxiliary craft are included. Yamamoto himself, aboard the super battleship Yamato, trailed 300 to 600 nautical miles behind Nagumo's carriers. Yamato displaced over 70,000 tons and carried 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest ever mounted on a warship. But Yamamoto would be useless during the decisive engagement. His plan was elaborate to the point of self-defeat. Forces were spread so widely they could not support each other. A simultaneous diversion against the Aleutian Islands would supposedly draw American attention northward, but in reality, it simply subtracted 2 carriers and substantial surface forces from the main effort. The plan's assumptions were catastrophically wrong. Japanese intelligence believed the Americans had only 2 operational carriers, Enterprise and Hornet. They believed Yorktown had been sunk at Coral Sea. They expected to have to lure the Americans out, not fight an ambush. Failed reconnaissance compounded these errors. Operation K, a planned flying boat reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor, was aborted when Nimitz stationed ships at the refueling point. Submarine cordons between Hawaii and Midway were established too late. The American carriers had already passed through. Nagumo was effectively blind. During pre-battle war games aboard Yamato in May, a Japanese officer playing the American side positioned carriers for an ambush that destroyed multiple Japanese carriers. The game umpire ruled this impossible and resurrected the losses. Yamamoto proceeded anyway. Admiral Nimitz faced a stark asymmetry. Against Yamamoto's armada, he could muster 3 carriers, 8 cruisers, 15 destroyers, and submarines, plus approximately 120 aircraft stationed on Midway itself. He had no battleships. His 3 carriers represented 75% of all American carriers in the Pacific and 50% of the nation's total. Losing them would leave the Pacific essentially undefended. But Nimitz possessed an advantage Yamamoto could not imagine. He knew the enemy's plan. On May 28th, he wrote to his commanders the defining instruction of the battle, the principle of calculated risk. Avoid exposure to superior forces unless such exposure would inflict greater damage on the enemy. The intelligence advantage made the gamble rational. Nimitz knew the Japanese had divided their forces so widely that only Nagumo's 4 carriers would be at the decisive point. Combining his 3 carriers' air groups with Midway's land-based aircraft gave him rough numerical parity with Nagumo's 248 carrier aircraft. He would position his carriers at a point designated Point Luck, approximately 300 miles northeast of Midway, and spring an ambush while the Japanese were focused on attacking the island. Vice Admiral William Halsey, the natural choice to command the carrier force, was hospitalized with severe shingles. He unhesitatingly recommended his cruiser commander, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, a surface warfare officer, not an aviator, but known as calm, analytical, and brilliant. Spruance commanded Task Force 16 with Enterprise and Hornet. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, the Coral Sea veteran aboard Yorktown, was overall tactical commander of Task Force 17. The most remarkable preparation was the resurrection of Yorktown. She limped into Pearl Harbor on May 27th, trailing a 10-mile oil slick from battle damage suffered at Coral Sea. Initial estimates called for 90 days of yard work. Nimitz personally inspected the damage, voided the safety rule requiring a day to purge aviation fuel tanks, and told the repair team that they must have this ship back in 3 days. 1,400 workmen labored around the clock for 72 hours. Damaged shell plating was welded rather than riveted because welding was faster, though the repair would be fragile. The bomb hole in the flight deck was patched so well it appeared never damaged. On May 30th, Yorktown sailed with work crews still aboard. Her air group was reconstituted with squadrons from the carrier Saratoga, including Bombing Squadron 3 under Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie. June 4th, 1942, began like any other day in the Pacific. At 0430, just as the first grey light touched the eastern horizon, Admiral Nagumo launched 108 aircraft to attack Midway Atoll. 36 Val dive bombers, 36 Kate torpedo bombers configured as level bombers, and 36 Zero fighters. Simultaneously, 7 scout planes launched for fleet reconnaissance. All departed on time except one. Tone's No. 4 scout plane launched approximately 30 minutes late due to catapult problems. Nagumo held half his strike aircraft in reserve. Kates on Akagi and Kaga were armed with anti-ship torpedoes, per Yamamoto's standing orders. His reserve was the Hammer, meant for American carriers. At 0534, a PBY Catalina flying boat from Midway reported sighting 2 Japanese carriers. At 0553, Midway radar detected the incoming Japanese strike at 93 miles. Every flyable aircraft on Midway scrambled. Marine F-2 Buffaloes and F-4 Wildcats intercepted the Japanese formation but were hopelessly outclassed. 15 fighters were shot down, with only 2 remaining flyable afterward. The Japanese lost about 11 aircraft. Midway's airfield was damaged but remained operational. At approximately 0700, strike leader Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga radioed Nagumo that there was need for a second attack wave. Between 0700 and 0830, Midway-based aircraft attacked the Japanese fleet in waves. All failed to score hits but exacted a terrible price and critically influenced Nagumo's decisions. 6 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers attacked first. 5 were shot down. 4 B-26 Marauders carrying torpedoes followed. 2 were destroyed and none hit, though Lieutenant James Murray's B-26 flew the entire length of carrier Akagi, his aircraft absorbing over 500 bullet holes before crash landing on Midway. 16 Marine SBD Dauntless dive bombers, under Major Lofton Henderson, executed a glide bombing attack because the pilots were too inexperienced for true dive bombing. 8 were destroyed, Henderson was killed, and no hits were scored. Henderson Field on Guadalcanal would later be named for him. 15 B-17 bombers attacked from high altitude, hitting nothing. 11 Marine SB-2U Vindicators attacked the battleship Haruna, also without effect. Not a single Midway-based aircraft scored a confirmed hit on any Japanese ship, but these attacks kept the carriers maneuvering, prevented flight deck operations, and planted a seed that would prove fatal. Nagumo began to believe a second strike on Midway was necessary. At 0715, with Tomonaga requesting a second Midway strike and scout planes reporting no American ships, Nagumo made the decision that would doom 4 carriers. He ordered the reserve Kate torpedo bombers on Akagi and Kaga to be rearmed. Anti-ship torpedoes were to be replaced with fragmentation bombs for a land attack on Midway. This directly violated Yamamoto's standing order to keep reserves armed for anti-ship operations. The rearming was labor-intensive. Only 6 aircraft could be processed simultaneously using hand trucks. Torpedoes, each weighing 1,949 pounds, had to be hand-cranked off aircraft, lowered via elevators, and replaced with 800-kilogram bombs brought up from magazines. At 0728, just 13 minutes later, catastrophe struck Nagumo's calculations. Tone's late-launching scout plane reported 10 ships, apparently enemy, sighted. But the pilot did not identify ship types. Nagumo halted the rearming and demanded clarification. At approximately 0820 to 0830, the answer came. Enemy force is accompanied by what appears to be an aircraft carrier. Nagumo now reversed the rearming order, back to anti-ship torpedoes, but the process was partially complete. Removed torpedoes could not be returned to the magazines until all bombs had been brought up. The ordnance carts and elevators were bottlenecked. The result, documented in post-war interrogations, was devastating. Torpedoes and bombs were stacked around the hangar decks rather than stowed safely in magazines. Fuel hoses snaked across the decks as refueling operations proceeded. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi aboard Hiryu broke protocol and urgently signaled Nagumo to launch immediately with whatever was available. Nagumo refused. Japanese doctrine demanded a coordinated, full-strength strike. Most of his Zero fighters were airborne on combat air patrol with no escorts available, and his Midway strike planes were returning, low on fuel, desperately needing to land. At approximately 0837, Nagumo began recovering the returning aircraft, choosing doctrine and pilot welfare over speed. He needed 45 uninterrupted minutes to respot, arm, fuel, and launch his counterstrike. He would never get them. At roughly 0700, Spruance had begun launching Enterprise and Hornets air groups at extreme range, approximately 155 nautical miles, to catch the Japanese recovering their Midway strike. Fletcher held Yorktown in reserve, launching approximately an hour later on a more accurate bearing. Everything went wrong immediately. At 0915, the Japanese fleet made a sharp course change to the northeast, invalidating the American intercept calculations. Hornet Air Group Commander Stanhope Ring led his dive bombers and fighters on an incorrect heading of approximately 265 degrees, nearly due west, in what became known as the Flight to Nowhere. None of Hornet's dive bombers or fighters ever found the Japanese fleet. All 10 Wildcats ditched at sea, and 2 pilots died. Most dive bombers diverted to Midway or barely returned to Hornet. Of 58 Hornet aircraft launched, only 20 returned to the carrier. Not one bomb was dropped on an enemy ship. But Lieutenant Commander John Waldron disagreed with Ring's heading. Waldron, Torpedo Squadron 8's commanding officer, was a 41-year-old of Lakota Sioux heritage from South Dakota. He broke formation and led his 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers on his own course at low altitude. 3 days earlier, he had told his pilots that they might want to tidy up their personal affairs and write a letter home just in case some of them did not get back. Waldron flew directly to the Japanese carriers. At 0920, Torpedo Squadron 8 attacked without fighter escort. The TBD Devastator was a death trap in 1942, a 1935 design, with a maximum speed of 206 miles per hour that required a long, straight torpedo run at low altitude, making it easy prey for Zeros. The Mark 13 torpedo was equally deficient. Wartime analysis showed that fewer than 1 in 3 gave satisfactory runs, with the rest running cold, sinking, veering off course, or failing to detonate. All 15 Devastators were shot down. 29 of 30 crew were killed. 0 torpedo hits. Waldron was last seen attempting to stand up and bail out as his burning aircraft plunged toward the sea. Ensign George Gay, flying in the last position, was the sole survivor. He launched his torpedo, which missed, flew directly over a Japanese carrier deck, and was shot down by 5 Zeros. His rear gunner was killed. Gay escaped the sinking aircraft with an injured hand, surfaced, and hid under a floating black seat cushion to avoid Japanese detection. He would spend 30 hours in the water, witnessing the entire battle unfold above him. At 0930 to 0940, Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked. 14 Devastators under Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, who flew despite cracked ribs, a punctured lung, and a face so bruised he could not wear flight goggles. When asked if he could fly, Lindsay responded that this was what he had been trained to do. 10 of 14 were shot down, Lindsay among them. 0 hits. At approximately 10 to 10:20, Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown attacked. 12 devastators under Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, with the only fighter escort of the morning, 6 F-4F Wildcats, led by Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch. Thatch deployed his revolutionary Thatch Weave defensive tactic, 2 fighters flying abreast, turning toward each other when attacked to create crossing fire solutions. His 6 Wildcats shot down 6 Zeros and probably 2 more, but were overwhelmed. 10 of 12 devastators were destroyed, Massey killed. 0 torpedo hits. The 3 torpedo squadron attacks achieved a devastating statistical record. 35 of 41 torpedo bombers destroyed, an 85% loss rate. All 3 commanding officers killed. 0 hits scored, but their sacrifice achieved something no torpedo could. They kept the carriers maneuvering for a solid hour, preventing Nagumo from spotting and launching his counterstrike. And they drew virtually all 45 airborne Zero fighters down to sea level, depleted of fuel and ammunition. The high-altitude approaches to the fleet lay undefended. While the torpedo bombers were dying, Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky was fighting a different battle against his fuel gauge. McClusky, a 40-year-old former fighter pilot who had recently transitioned to dive bombers, was leading 33 SBD Dauntlesses from Enterprise. He reached the anticipated intercept point at approximately 0920 and found empty ocean. His fuel was critically low. He faced a stark choice: turn back to Enterprise, divert to Midway, or continue searching. McClusky reasoned that if the Japanese were south, PBY Catalinas would have reported them. He chose to continue northwest. Nimitz later said that McClusky's decision to continue the search and his judgment decided the fate of our carrier task force and our forces at Midway. At approximately 0955, McClusky spotted a lone Japanese warship steaming northeast at full speed, its bow wave creating what he described as a large white arrow on the water. This was the destroyer Arashi, which had been detached to depth charge the American submarine Nautilus and was now racing to rejoin the fleet. McClusky followed Arashi's heading. At approximately 10:05, he sighted the wakes of the Japanese carrier force. The chain of causation was breathtaking. Smoke from the first Midway attacks drew submarine Nautilus. Nautilus made unsuccessful torpedo attacks. Arashi was left behind to depth charge Nautilus. Arashi's high-speed return caught McClusky's eye. McClusky followed Arashi directly to the carriers. At approximately 10:20, McClusky ordered the attack on the 2 nearest carriers. By extraordinary coincidence, at that same moment, having launched an hour later from a different carrier on a different course, Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's Bombing Squadron 3 from Yorktown, 17 SBD Dauntlesses arrived from a completely different direction, targeting Soryu. Neither group knew the other was there. Scattered clouds at approximately 10,000 feet provided concealment for the dive bombers' approach. Below, Torpedo Squadron 3's attack was still drawing the last Zero fighters to sea level. Neither the Japanese Combat Air Patrol nor shipboard lookouts saw the SBDs until they were already in their dives. Kaga was struck first, at approximately 10:22. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, remembering Pearl Harbor and thinking of the Arizona, scored the first confirmed hit. At least 4 1,000-pound bombs struck among armed and fueled aircraft on the flight deck. One hit the bridge, killing Captain Jisaku Okada and most bridge officers. Massive secondary explosions erupted from fuel and ordnance. Kaga became an inferno within minutes. Akagi was struck at approximately 10:22 to 10:26. McClusky and most of Scouting Squadron 6 had inadvertently joined Bombing Squadron 6 in diving on Kaga. Lieutenant Richard Best, commanding Bombing Squadron 6, noticed the error and pulled away with only 2 wingmen, Lieutenants Edwin Kroger and Ensign Frederick Weber, to attack Akagi. Weber's bomb landed near the stern, its shockwave jamming the rudder. Best's single bomb punched through the flight deck at the edge of the midship elevator and exploded in the upper hangar deck amid 18 Kate torpedo bombers being armed and fueled. That single bomb doomed Nagumo's flagship. Aviation gasoline ignited. Stacked ordnance, torpedoes, and bombs left unsecured from the rearming detonated in chain reactions. Nagumo's chief of staff, Kusaka, later wrote that a terrific fire broke out, with bodies all over the place, and planes standing tail up, belching livid flames and jet-black smoke. Soryu was struck at approximately 10:25. Leslie's Bombing Squadron 3 scored 3 direct 1,000-pound bomb hits, 1 in front of the forward elevator, 2 straddling the midship elevator. Leslie himself, whose bomb had accidentally jettisoned after takeoff due to a faulty electrical arming switch, still dove on Soryu, strafing the deck with 50-caliber guns to suppress anti-aircraft fire. Armed and fueled aircraft on both hangar decks detonated. Ruptured steam pipes in the boiler rooms killed engine crew instantly. By 10:30, Soryu was transformed into a hell of smoke and flames. In approximately 5 to 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers were fatally damaged. Had Best not redirected to Akagi with just 2 wingmen, that carrier would have escaped undamaged, its air group potentially capable of crippling all 3 American carriers. McClusky returned to Enterprise with over 50 bullet holes in his aircraft, shrapnel wounds in his shoulder, and fewer than 5 gallons of fuel remaining. 10 planes from his group had to ditch at sea. Their crews were never found. Hiryu alone survived the morning attack. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi wasted no time. At approximately 1100, he launched 18 VAL dive bombers and 6 Zero escorts under Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, who followed retreating American aircraft back toward the American fleet. At approximately noon, Hiryu's dive bombers struck Yorktown. Despite losing 13 of 18 VALs and 3 of 6 Zeros to fighters and anti-aircraft fire, 3 bombs hit. 1 penetrated near the number 1 elevator and detonated in crew compartments. 1 blew through the flight deck and extinguished the boiler uptakes, killing all but 1 boiler. 1 hit an anti-aircraft mount. Yorktown went dead in the water. Fletcher transferred his flag to the cruiser Astoria. In one of the war's most impressive damage control feats, Yorktown's crew patched the flight deck, relit 4 of 6 boilers, and achieved 19 to 20 knots within approximately 1 hour, resuming flight operations. This feat proved so convincing that Japanese pilots from the next strike mistook her for an undamaged carrier, believing they were attacking a second American ship. At approximately 13:31, Yamaguchi launched his second strike. 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros, led by Lieutenant Tomonaga, who knowingly flew in a plane with a damaged fuel tank that held insufficient fuel for return. It was a one-way mission. At approximately 14:40 to 14:45, 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side. All power was lost, the rudder jammed, and progressive flooding produced a 26-degree list. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered abandon ship. But the Americans had already found Hiryu. Yorktown scouts located the surviving carrier, and at approximately 1700, 24 SBDs from Enterprise, including Yorktown orphans, attacked. 4 bombs struck Hiryu, 1 smashing the forward elevator. Among the pilots was Dick Best, who may have scored one of the hits, making him the only pilot in the Second World War confirmed to have bombed 2 enemy carriers in a single day. Hiryu was left ablaze and unable to operate aircraft. Kaga sank at approximately 1925 on June 4th, racked by massive explosions. 814 of her crew, of approximately 1,708, were killed, the highest absolute death toll of any carrier at Midway. Soryu was scuttled by the destroyer Isokaze at approximately 1913 on June 4th. Before the order, Chief Petty Officer Abe, a Navy wrestling champion, was sent to rescue Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto from the bridge. Abe found the captain standing motionless, sword in hand, gazing toward the bow. He pleaded with Yanagimoto to come. Met with silence, Abe moved to carry him bodily, but the captain's sheer strength of will stopped him short. As Abe retreated tearfully, he heard Captain Yanagimoto calmly singing Kimigayo, the Japanese national anthem. Yanagimoto went down with his ship. 711 of 1,103 crew were killed, a 64.5% mortality rate, the highest of all 4 carriers. Akagi burned through the night. At 10:46 on June 4th, Nagumo had been forced to climb from his bridge window and transfer his flag to the light cruiser Nagara. Captain Taijiro Aoki initially refused to leave, but was eventually persuaded by his crew to abandon ship. On the morning of June 5th, Yamamoto, initially refusing to authorize the scuttling of the crown jewel of his fleet, finally relented. Japanese destroyers torpedoed Akagi, and she sank before sunrise. 267 of approximately 1,630 crew were killed. Hiryu kept moving until midnight, when fires stopped her engines. Yamaguchi gathered approximately 800 surviving crewmen on the flight deck and led them in yelling Banzai 3 times toward Tokyo, followed by the national anthem. He told his men that he commanded all of them to leave the ship and continue their loyal service to His Majesty. He gave his cap to Commander Ito as a keepsake for his family. His last message to Nagumo expressed that he had no words to apologize for what had happened, only a wish for a stronger Japanese Navy and revenge. In a final exchange with Captain Tomeo Kaku, Yamaguchi said that they should enjoy the beauty of the moon. Kaku responded that the moon shone bright and must be in its 21st day. Both went down with the ship. Hiryu sank on the morning of June 5th. 392 crew were killed, including Yamaguchi and Kaku. Yamaguchi was posthumously promoted to Vice Admiral. Aboard Akagi, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the hero who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, lay in sick bay with appendicitis, unable to lead operations. Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant air officer who planned Pearl Harbor, was bedridden with pneumonia. Japan's 2 most capable air tacticians were incapacitated at the decisive moment. When Best's bomb struck, Fuchida staggered to the ready room and found it already jammed with badly burned victims from the hangar deck. He broke both ankles, escaping the ship. On the bridge, Genda surveyed the burning carriers Kaga and Soryu and uttered what may be the most understated words of the Pacific War. Shimata, roughly translated, "We goofed." On Soryu, boiler room crews were killed instantly when bomb explosions ruptured steam pipes. They were literally cooked alive by escaping steam. Men in the hangar decks were caught among exploding ordnance and aviation fuel fires. Some engineers escaped only at the last moment when the ship was being scuttled, having been trapped below for hours. On the American side, Dick Best, the pilot whose single bomb doomed Akagi, had inhaled caustic soda fumes from a faulty oxygen rebreather system before launch. He ignored the burning sensation and flew both the morning and afternoon strikes. The next day, he began coughing blood. The fumes had activated latent tuberculosis. After 32 months of treatment, the finest dive bomber pilot in the Pacific Fleet was medically retired at age 34. He later joined the RAND Corporation and died in 2001 at age 91, buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Ensign Wesley Osmus of Torpedo Squadron 3, shot down during the torpedo attacks, was captured by the crew of the destroyer Arashi. After interrogation, he was murdered, a documented war crime. His body was never recovered. Nagumo himself, after the battle, was found by his chief of staff, Kusaka, in a state of near catatonic despair, seemingly contemplating suicide. Kusaka talked him out of it. Nagumo reportedly cried when talking about Midway to his 2 sons in 1944. He later committed suicide during the Battle of Saipan. On the night of June 4th, Spruance made a controversial decision that may have saved the American fleet. He withdrew Task Force 16 eastward, rather than pursuing the Japanese into the darkness. His staff urged pursuit. Spruance refused. Japanese surface forces excelled at night fighting, and Yamamoto had dispatched powerful battleship and cruiser formations eastward, hoping for exactly such an engagement. Historian Samuel Eliot Morrison later wrote that Spruance's performance was superb. On June 5th, the cruisers Mogami and Mikuma, retreating from a cancelled Midway bombardment mission, collided while evading the American submarine Tambor. Mogami's bow was crushed. Mikuma's fuel tanks ruptured, leaving an oil trail. On June 6th, Enterprise and Hornet dive bombers found the crippled cruisers and attacked in 3 waves. Mikuma absorbed 5 direct bomb hits. Her torpedo magazines exploded, sinking her with approximately 700 casualties. Mogami survived despite 6 bomb hits because her crew had the foresight to jettison their torpedoes before they could detonate, but she was out of action for 10 months. Also, on June 6th in the early afternoon, the Japanese submarine I-168 penetrated the destroyer screen around the abandoned Yorktown. 4 torpedoes were fired. One struck the destroyer Hammond, which was alongside providing auxiliary power to a salvage party. Hammond sank almost immediately. Her depth charges detonated after she went under, killing additional survivors in the water. Approximately 80 Hammond crewmen died total. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown. Captain Buckmaster's 170-man volunteer salvage party had been making progress, pushing aircraft overboard and reducing the list by 2 degrees, but the submarine attack was fatal. On June 7th, Yorktown capsized to port and sank in approximately 3,000 fathoms. Nearby destroyers lowered their flags to half-mast. Japanese losses were catastrophic. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, 1 heavy cruiser, Mikuma, over 3,000 killed. 248 to 292 aircraft destroyed. American losses were significant but bearable. 1 carrier, Yorktown, 1 destroyer, Hammond, 307 killed, approximately 150 aircraft lost. The asymmetry was staggering. Japan lost 4 irreplaceable fleet carriers. The United States lost 1 damaged veteran. Japan committed the vast majority of its operational fleet. The United States had 28 warships, plus Midway's garrison. The outnumbered, outgunned Americans destroyed the offensive capability of the Imperial Japanese Navy in a single day. The carrier losses were devastating because Japan could not replace them quickly. The armored fleet carrier Taiho, which took 32 months to build, was sunk just 3 months after commissioning at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The United States, by contrast, laid down 26 Essex-class carriers during the war, commissioning 24. The first Essex was commissioned in December 1942. By 1944, American carrier superiority was overwhelming. The aircrew losses, while significant, were not immediately crippling. The greater catastrophe was the loss of over 40% of the carrier's trained aircraft mechanics, technicians, flight deck crews, and armorers. This organizational knowledge could not be rapidly replaced. The subsequent battles of the Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, and the grinding Guadalcanal campaign compounded these losses. By the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japan had rebuilt carrier air groups on paper, but the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot destroyed 90% of that rebuilt air power in 2 days. The Japanese cover-up revealed the magnitude of the disaster. In concert with Emperor Hirohito, the Navy announced Midway as another smashing victory, claiming 2 American carriers sunk while mentioning, almost as an aside, that Kaga and Soryu had been lost. Akagi and Hiryu were kept on the Navy's official roster until September 25, 1942. Wounded sailors were quarantined. Participants were forbidden from discussing the battle. The Japanese public did not learn the truth until the early 1950s. After Midway, Japan never again mounted a major offensive operation in the Pacific. Planned invasions of New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa were cancelled. Just 2 months later, the United States launched the Guadalcanal campaign in August 1942, the first major Allied offensive, made possible because Midway had eliminated Japan's carrier offensive capability. Could Japan have won if Midway had gone differently? Most historians agree the answer is no. American industrial capacity was simply overwhelming. The United States built more ships between 1941 and 1944 than the entire pre-war navies of Japan and the United States combined. A Japanese Midway victory would have prolonged the war and made the Pacific campaign far more costly, but the massive American industrial build-up would have overwhelmed Japan by 1944 regardless. What Midway did was compress the timeline dramatically, transforming a potential years-long defensive struggle into an offensive war that reached Tokyo's doorstep in 3 years. Historian John Keegan called Midway the most stunning and decisive blow in the history of naval warfare. Craig Simmons ranked it alongside Salamis, Trafalgar, and Tsushima. It was a battle decided by intelligence brilliance, the sacrifice of men who pressed attacks knowing they would die, a single pilot's refusal to turn back on a fuel gauge reading near empty, a destroyer's wake pointing like an arrow to 4 doomed carriers, and 5 minutes of screaming vertical dives that changed the world. The physical legacy of Midway lies scattered across the ocean floor, more than 17,000 feet beneath the Pacific's surface. For decades, the exact locations of the 4 Japanese carriers remained a mystery. In May 1998, an expedition led by Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who had discovered the Titanic, located the wreck of Yorktown. She rested upright on the sea floor, remarkably intact, her gun mounts still pointing skyward, as if ready to defend against one final attack. The Japanese carriers proved more elusive. In October 2019, The research vessel Petrel discovered cargo at a depth of approximately 17,700 feet. She lay upside down on the seafloor, her massive hull a testament to the violence of her final moments. Days later, the team found a cargo nearby, also inverted, broken apart by the internal explosions that had sealed her fate. Soryu and Hiryu remain undiscovered, their final resting places still unknown. Hiryu's search is particularly difficult because she drifted for nearly 17 hours between being crippled and sinking, placing her wreck site far from the other carriers. The men who died at Midway came from both sides of the Pacific. American torpedo bomber crews, who flew into certain death to buy time they would never see used. Japanese sailors trapped in flooding compartments as their ships capsized. Fighter pilots who exhausted their ammunition defending their carriers. Engineers who stayed at their posts until steam and fire took them. They were fathers, sons, brothers, and husbands. Some had been at sea for years, others had barely finished training. Most never knew whether their sacrifice meant anything. It meant everything. The codebreakers in the basement at Pearl Harbor, working 20-hour days in their smoking jackets. The repair crews who rebuilt Yorktown in 72 hours instead of 90 days. The pilots who continued their dives even as anti-aircraft fire tore through their wings. The commanders who made the right decisions in moments of terrible uncertainty. And the thousands of ordinary sailors who simply did their jobs, not knowing that a small Pacific atoll would become the hinge on which the war turned. Admiral Yamamoto had famously warned before the war that he could run wild for the first 6 months or a year, but had utterly no confidence for the second and third years. Midway came almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. The 6 months were over, the tide had turned, and 4 carriers on the ocean floor bore witness to the 5 minutes that changed history. The families of those who died at Midway have kept their memory alive across generations. In Japan, memorial services honor all who fell in the battle. American surviving veterans shared their stories with historians, authors, and filmmakers, determined that their comrades' sacrifice not be forgotten. George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8's Hornet-based TBD group, passed away on October 21, 1994. He spent decades recounting his unique experience of watching the battle unfold from the water while clinging to a seat cushion, hidden from Japanese ships passing nearby. The debate over what truly decided Midway continues among naval historians. Some argue that American intelligence was so complete that victory was virtually assured once Nimitz committed to the battle. Others emphasize the extraordinary luck of McClusky finding the fleet, the fortuitous timing of the dive bomber attacks, and the critical role of the torpedo squadron's sacrifice. Still others point to Japanese errors, from Yamamoto's over-complex plan to Nagumo's fateful rearming decision, as the true causes of their defeat. The truth encompasses all of these factors. Midway was decided by intelligence, yes, but intelligence alone did not sink carriers. It was decided by luck, yes, but luck favors the prepared, and the American pilots who pressed home their attacks created opportunities for that luck to matter. It was decided by Japanese mistakes, yes, but those mistakes were exploited by American courage and skill. Midway stands as perhaps the most complex naval engagement ever fought, a battle where dozens of independent decisions, each reasonable in isolation, combined to produce a result that changed history. The men who flew those torpedo bombers knew their odds. They knew the Devastator was obsolete, knew the Mark 13 torpedo was unreliable, knew they would face concentrated anti-aircraft fire and swarming Zeros without fighter cover. They flew anyway. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's final message to his squadron has become one of the most famous communications in naval history. He told them that if only one plane was left to make a final run in, he wanted that man to go in and get a hit. Those men created the conditions for victory. When the dive bombers arrived at 10:20, they found an enemy that had been kept off balance for over an hour, whose fighters were out of position and low on ammunition, whose ships were maneuvering to avoid torpedoes rather than spotted for launch. The torpedo bombers scored no hits, but they scored something more valuable. They gave the dive bombers their moment. Dick Best's bomb on Akagi has been called the most consequential single bomb of the Pacific War. One weapon, one pilot, one decision to redirect when his formation drifted toward the wrong target. Best made that choice in seconds, with anti-aircraft fire bursting around him, with only 2 wingmen following, with no guarantee of success. He made it because that was what dive bomber pilots did. They went in and got hits. The 1942 Japanese Navy was not defeated by superior American equipment. The Devastator was inferior to its Japanese counterparts. The Mark 13 torpedo was far less reliable than Japanese models. American anti-aircraft fire was no more accurate than Japanese. What defeated the Kido Butai was a combination of preparation, sacrifice, and execution that came together in a single morning. The codebreakers prepared the battlefield. The torpedo bombers sacrificed themselves to create the opening. And the dive bomber pilots executed with devastating precision when that opening appeared. When the last carrier slipped beneath the waves on June 7, 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost more than 4 ships. They had lost the initiative. They had lost their best-trained crews. They had lost the confidence that had carried them from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon. They would never recover. In the years since, Midway has been studied in war colleges around the world as the quintessential example of a decisive naval engagement. It demonstrated that intelligence could overcome material superiority. It proved that courage could create opportunities that skill could exploit. It showed that in modern naval warfare, a few minutes could change everything. But perhaps the most enduring lesson of Midway is simpler. It is a lesson about men who faced impossible odds and pressed home their attacks anyway. About commanders who risked everything on imperfect information. About pilots who continued searches on empty fuel tanks. About engineers who rebuilt a crippled carrier in 3 days. About codebreakers who worked themselves to exhaustion in basement rooms. About ordinary people who rose to extraordinary occasions because that was what duty demanded. June 4, 1942. The 5 minutes that changed the world. And the men who made those minutes matter will never be forgotten.